Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the third episode of If Data Could Talk. I'm your host, Andy Cotgreave, technical evangelist at Tableau and co-author of the Big Book of Dashboards. If this is your first time watching, welcome along. In this series, we're looking at how data is used across all spheres of life, from politics to media to business and everywhere else. And our goal is to help you take what we find and apply those to your own use of data, whether that is in business or for your own personal use. This week, I'm delighted to be joined once again by Amanda Makulec, who is Senior Data Visualization Lead at Accela and Operations Director at Data Visualization Society. Welcome back, Amanda. What have you got in store for us today?
So today we're going to talk about how consumer behavior is changing in the wake of all of the social distancing and different shutdowns.
Cool, great. And we also have another special guest. This time it's Chantilly Jaggernauth, who is VP of Training and Visualization at Lovalytics. She's also the foundation of Millennials and Data, and she's a Tableau Zen Master. Welcome aboard, Chantilly. How are you today?
Hello, thank you for having me, Andy.
It's great to have you here. I actually had a question. How do I pronounce Lovalytics? I've never actually read that word out right. Is it Lovalytics or Lovalytics?
Lovalytics.
Lovalytics, right. Okay, it's Lovalytics, everybody. So we're going to be chatting to Chantilly after Amanda about how being a data explorer and satisfying your own curiosity to find answers to the deep questions, or the big and small questions we're finding ourselves asking at the moment. But first, it's time to take a look at some of the data visualizations and data stories that we found most interesting and exciting this week. This week, it's Amanda's turn to take the lead. So Amanda, take it away.
Thanks, Andy. All right, so this week we're going to talk about how consumer behavior has been changing. There was some data put out by Yelp that was picked up also by the Washington Post, looking at some changes in consumer behavior. And I want to give Yelp a shout out in the fact that they actually put some additional notes about their methodology and some detail on how they collected and were reporting on the data. So as we walk through these charts that we're going to take a look at and critique a little bit, I want to be mindful of what we're looking at. And Yelp's data looks at consumer interest, and they measured that in terms of daily US-based counts of a few of the many actions people take to connect with businesses on Yelp. So rather than this being simply searches or looking for information, it also includes things like posting photos or reviews, which we can expect might be going down in this period while we have restaurants closed and other places that often get Yelp reviews shuttered. So you can see that they've given some clear information about what they've included, looking at the 500 biggest US categories. So let's dive into some of the charts that they gave us and talk about what we liked about them. So in the Yelp report, they actually talk about different categories that are on the rise, different categories where we're seeing increases in consumer interest. The way they've arranged this small multiples view is really interesting to me because they've started in the upper left-hand corner with the item with the category with the biggest rise. You can see that plus 547%. And then it goes down over to art galleries in the lower corner. You can see that the y-axis has been scaled such that each of these is on the same y-axis, but that it's a little bit tricky because you have to read across to find the different highs and lows. You can see there's some categories we could expect, right? So we see increases in consumer interest around skilled nursing or hospitals. And we could expect that being in the midst of a global pandemic. We also see some categories on the rise that are related probably to our working from home. So with gyms closed, people looking for fitness and exercise equipment, or looking for television service providers and information about those different services and products. That makes sense because we're at home a bit more. Then we start getting into some of these interesting categories. Event photography being up, country clubs, where I expect people have to go congregate in person, which surprises me in a time of social distancing, and even art galleries. And art galleries, they actually called out in some of their article talking about the fact that art galleries are finding ways to interact with and connect with people through virtual showings and other ways of bringing people together virtually, which I thought was a really interesting point. There's finally just a couple fun ones on here. In the top of the list, pet breeders, people who maybe are at home by themselves looking for a new furry companion, trying to find a way to bring a new fuzzy friend into their home, and also chicken wings. Seem to be really interested in chicken wings. Who knew? They go ahead and they also show the same small multiples view for categories that are falling. So they look at the different categories where interest has declined. And we can see that that's pretty consistently across different places where we would congregate in public. But it's interesting looking at the comparison between the kind of highs and lows on overall change, where breweries are the highest at -71, so down 71%, compared to fitness and exercise equipment being up by 547%, which is a lot. So as we look at these, the Washington Post took a slightly different approach to looking at this data. And instead of looking at things as trends over time in this small multiples view that lets me see kind of what's happened over the month of March, they instead looked at this as a lollipop chart and instead looked at change from a year earlier in activity and looked at how different categories stacked up against each other. And based on slightly different periods, you can see that the ordering is a little bit different. Andy, anything jump out to you on these lollipop charts, which I hear that you might be credited with some of the initial naming of the lollipop chart?
It is true. I did come up with the name, not with the chart type itself, but yes, 10 years ago, I believe that was. But I built a small multiple today looking at using Apple's new mobility chain or map searching data, right? And small multiples are great for reading. You have to read them left to right, but you can't compare those categories, right? So I can't compare breweries on the small multiple. I can't compare breweries to day spas. I mean, I can, but not very accurately, right? Whereas in the lollipop, you're seeing a single data point, and who doesn't love length as a pre-attentive attribute to accurately compare measures? So every chart is a compromise, right, Amanda? I can see the full time series and read and consume these things, or I can get a super quick at a glance view of one point in time. The other thing I noticed is what's interesting is they've both, the Washington Post and the Yelp data, they've selectively chosen different categories as well, haven't they? Am I right? Because guns and ammo is #1, whereas they chose not to do that in the Yelp data, and I wonder what that was for, what the reason.
Well, I'm curious if it's an aggregation, right? So we see gunsmiths being here on the small multiples chart, broken out more specifically. And so I'm curious if there's an overarching kind of grouping of the categories, which, not looking at the more granular data, I don't really know.
Yeah, well, gunsmiths there is #4 in the left-hand lollipop. I wonder whether Yelp, since they published the small multiples, maybe didn't want to choose such a potentially unpleasant story to lead with, because it's a much nicer story to say fitness and community agriculture is seeing the biggest upgrowth, whereas Washington Post, being more media and newsy, are happy to go, look, people are searching for guns and ammo. I wonder if there's just a storytelling focused decision there.
Yeah, it's a curious question. Some of the other ones are different though, right? So we don't see guns or rifle ranges. We don't see grocery on some of the Yelp reviews or the Yelp charts. So I think sometimes that's where it's important to look and see kind of what the methods are, or how people are quantifying it, why those listings were different. Because while the data might look the same on the surface, when you start to dig into it, it does actually present different stories. Though personally, I love that community supported agriculture is up there on both of them, showing that we're looking for ways to get closer to our suppliers for food. I know in DC, they've worked really hard to keep the farmers markets open, which I appreciate a lot in terms of having good social distancing practices, encouraging and requiring people to wear masks to protect others who are in the market. So I think it's great that there's some of those items being called out here.
Yeah, I think it shows, I mean, Kim Reese, who used to run Periscopic, the data visualization consultancy, and now works at a bank in Washington, DC. One of the things she said that's resonated with me since, I think it was probably 6 years ago, she said it, every visualization is a means to convey an opinion or an argument. And as data analysts, when we're trying to convey a story, we're making choices about what to leave in and what to take out. And, as you can see, as they show that, as these two stories show different categories, they're making those different decisions. And, we have to embrace the fact that it's okay to make those decisions, and it's okay to choose to convey a different story. So, but, to be honest about it, don't do it to deceive, but do it to, support your story and allow people to dig deeper.
That's a great call out. I think as we dig into one of these categories specifically, Yelp went ahead and dug in, understandably, to looking at delivery and takeout being a thing that's replacing dine-in. When I saw this chart in the Yelp series, I kind of looked at it and said, so this chart really is a sentence, and the sentence is right there in front of me, right? Delivery and takeout are more popular than usual, specifically 300 times. I kind of looked at this, I was like, yep, that's right. That sentence is accurate and correct. But I have no idea what the measure is that they're plotting here, given that there isn't any kind of clear y-axis labeling from a what is the actual measure that's being plotted, right?
Yeah, it just seemed to me, I mean, I spent more time deciphering this chart than I did deciphering the sentence it told me.
So we can actually look at this, and it does tell us in the text what the actual ratio is. It's a ratio of rolling 7-day total of searches for dine out options, blah, 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 blah. So it is a long measure that they've kind of put in there, and maybe that's why they left it off the y-axis. I actually think when we think about the story and looking to understand what's happening with delivery and takeout, I actually really appreciated the work the Washington Post did to kind of look at this a little bit differently. They went ahead and looked at that takeout to dine-in ratio and called it out as such. Added some nice clear reference bands for when there were weekends, which matter a little bit less here, I think, as we look at this really steep, I mean, it almost looks exponential, right?
Yeah.
Growth of what that ratio looks like. When we look at that and we look at Google search trends, we can actually see more breakout of when there was this kind of crossover where the searches for takeout increased above reservations. And I actually think that that chart actually tells me more about patterns of behavior and what's happening in terms of what people are looking for and searching for in this current environment than the ratio piece, which I found to be a little bit harder to make sense of and understand.
Can I ask a quick question here? I've just realized I've forgotten, I've learned so much in this field. I've actually forgotten some of the lessons, right? Don't we say sometimes that crossovers of categories create sort of points of interest that aren't necessarily true, but that's more about dual axes, isn't it? This is a single axis, so that crossover is a proper.
And I think that they've ranked it. So Google search trends has that popularity kind of index ranking of the different search trends, and so I think that they've already kind of in what data they choose to present here, they've actually found a way to kind of normalize that and make it something we could compare a bit more. But yeah,
so in this case, it is a fairly valid flip inflection to look at, right?
I think so.
Yeah.
Chantilly, any thoughts?
Yeah, I actually prefer the Google Trends chart. I like to see that crossover. It definitely makes sense if we think about like personal behaviors. You know, most of us are now looking for takeouts than we are reservations. I'm actually surprised that reservations isn't lower to 0. You know, given this day and age, but you know, it's understandable.
Well, I do think that the y-axis, I think, is the relative popularity of that search term, not just a number, right? So I think that kind of making sense of what that looks like and having maybe some knowledge around what Google Analytics does is important there. And I love that here the weekend pieces are actually more important. I think the weekend doesn't matter as much up top, but when we start looking like, of course we look for more reservations on the weekend when I'm not coming home from work and just trying to go ahead and make it through my evening and cook myself dinner. So I think that those reference bars actually help a lot more on the Google search trends chart than they do on the takeout to dine in.
So I've got something else here, right? I'm having an epiphany. So who knows, this could sound absolute rubbish, right? But if you look at the top chart, it's how many things do you have to register before you get the point of the chart? And for me, on the top chart, it feels like I've got to look at the line, read the line, look at the axis, look at the title, look at the note, and actually consume every single piece of that visualization before I get the point. Whereas at a minimum on the Google search trends, I'm looking at 2 words, takeout reservations, I'm looking at the inflection point, and I'm looking at a date, and I'm kind of done at that point. So I don't know what I've just discovered or explained, but I think that's why I like it more, because I have to do less to get the message.
Yeah, and I don't know that it's something we need to spend more time reading, right? But I think it's interesting that so many companies are making more of this data about what's happening in the world around us available. So I'm really grateful that we have the ability to kind of look at this kind of information and understand what's happening. So one more chart I want to touch on from this Yelp study was more a map than a chart. They title it "The Bigger the Outbreak, the Bigger the Impact" on businesses. And as you can see, it's proportional symbols. So number of cases is the bubble size, and then impact on consumer interest is this other color legend that we have showing from low to high. And if you actually look at the tooltips here, it will tell you the ranking on 18th largest impact on consumer interest, for example. Now, I've got some questions about kind of what this is telling me and whether this is really something that needed to be on a map. Thoughts?
Yeah, when I first saw it, I thought, 2 measures, I'd rather see a scatter plot.
Yeah, same here. Bubbles and the colors, it's hard to differentiate. I think what sticks out the most immediately is like the large red bubbles. And then you don't even go to a state like Illinois to look at like number of the impact of consumer interest. So
Mhm.
I would definitely like to see the two measures plotted on a scatter plot versus plotted, on a map.
Yeah, there's also a strange situational moment in that I know when I look at this, I'm just like, well, it just looks like case data, right? It almost takes you back to the XKCD comic where they go, most of your maps just look like population distribution, right? So I'm not seeing a new story jump out because I've spent so many days just like scrolling through case maps like this. So it's yeah.
Sure. And I would say, like Illinois, I look at, my parents are in Illinois, and they had one of the earlier statewide lockdowns, right? And so when you look at that, you see it's 18th largest out of 50 states, and we look at that information. The question I ask here is also just consumer interest. I mean, we have things that we showed have a really huge spike in consumer interest overall, right?
Yep.
So, I mean, consumer interest you can have without actually going ahead and going anywhere in person. So thankfully, the Washington Post actually did say yes to your ask, Andy, and they did look at this as a scatter plot, looking at the difference from expected activity level, so a little bit different measure there, at those states' most affected sectors, and then looked at health impact. And what I like about this is that they did look at a slightly different measure, right? Instead of looking just, I think, at consumer interest, it's at activity level. But it's framed differently, right? So just looking at these charts next to each other, I don't necessarily know kind of how those are being plotted differently. But as we kind of drill into this and we look at this overall kind of measure that they've looked at, difference from activity level, I had to actually reset my expectations for a second looking at this because of the fact that that y-axis, as we get to larger negative values, is actually means that there's been a greater difference or change in activity level. And so instead of things as they get more shut down being higher, as they get more shut down, they're actually lower on the plot, which I had to kind of mentally do a gut check on. They do some nice jobs though labeling things here, so showing kind of what each quadrant means. So talking about few cases less shut down, many cases more shut down. And I'm just curious what you think about what context might be missing here, though, because as we look at these kind of just difference from expected activity level against cases, that just feels like something where we're kind of trying to find a story and I'm not quite sure what's there.
Yeah, I mean, there's not really much comparison to normality. You know, what's the normal situation pre-COVID to these cases? I also found when I saw this, I was great, a scatter plot, and then I thought, well, in this case, the annotation layer is pretty dense. So and even the layout doesn't, the trend line doesn't look as trustable as I might want it to be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
The size is what does it for me. You know, there's nowhere does it show like a legend in terms of like what do the size of the bubbles mean. I assume that they mean the cases, but you know, that's just my assumption. I would like to see like some sort of a legend to indicate that.
yeah, and I think that's the thing I've seen in a lot of scatter plots that I'm seeing people take something around cases, right? So here we've got cases on the x-axis and juxtaposing them against something else and looking for some kind of relationship. But there's so much complexity to this, right? In terms of when the first case was detected in each of these different states, what the actual shutdown activity has been, what other contextual factors we have, even things like testing that may be impacting interactivity, what happens in terms of activity levels for states that have more essential workers and more businesses that are staying open, maybe because maybe medical services are a big part of their state economy. Maybe they're a state that has a huge Amazon processing plant, right? In terms of shipping things out. We have to look at the ways in which we have different severity indices. And so that's where I think this kind of Yelp measure around change in consumer interest, if it's still the same here, is a little bit tricky or misleading. What I appreciate though is that people have been trying to add that context in the text in the articles. I think that's why it really matters that we don't just look at charts by themselves and try to take away everything we need just from the chart. Just underneath this chart in the article in the Washington Post, they talk about the fact that the South, who we actually can see have a lot of states that are kind of zooming over here towards this side, where we have less shutdown activity, that we actually see that the South is actually having a number of issues around how they respond because of paid sick leave policies and refusal of Southern states to expand Medicaid. So they try to start digging into why these different things are happening. Finally, I want to just kind of tap on one last thing, which is how these things impact me personally from a consumer behavior perspective. So as I think about the ways in which different companies are reacting, I think it's important to understand kind of who's stepping up and who's trying to be helpful towards different people who may be trying to work from home more, trying to deal with childcare challenges, other things. And so there are different trackers that have been built. This is one example from Just Capital that actually looks at the ways in which different companies are responding with new policies and practices. And for me, this gives me information that I might care about, right? So I might want to find companies that are actually doing backup dependent care, for example, for their employees. And I can look for companies that are offering that kind of service. And so for me, as I think about data that's relevant to me in the current environment, the really important piece is what information can I use to inform my own personal choices and behavior on a day-to-day basis? And for me, it's still not watching the case counts climb, right? It's this kind of context that helps make the data personal or gives me information that I actually can then use to inform my own behavior and decisions. So Andy, I know that there's been some really interesting other work that's been happening with other data visualization designers and data journalists trying to go ahead and look at this personal story. Maybe some thoughts from your side?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I like that. I really like that second data story because it's talking about qualitative data. It's also brings us on to what we're going to talk to Chantilly about in that, you know, it's like, how does this situation we're in affect me or my family or my loved ones or my associates? And how can I use data to start digging into that? So, which is a great segue because that allows me to introduce Chantilly Jaggernauth. Chantilly, just say hi, give us a quick introduction about yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hello, Chantilly Jaggernauth. I am the Vice President of Data Visualization and Training at Lovelytics, a consulting company, data analytics consulting company based out of Arlington, Virginia. I'm also a Tableau Zen Master, 2 times Tableau Zen Master, and I'm the founder of Millennials and Data, which is a nonprofit organization that looks to train and help millennials really understand how to use data in their everyday lives.
Awesome. Well, it's great to have you with us. Thank you for joining. So what we wanted to talk about today is you're known for making really well-designed, interesting data stories, looking at data from some other perspectives. And in the sort of the COVID-19 situation, you've been looking at some of the data that is not about cases, right? And I think as we're seeing a trend through the media moving away from just monitoring case data to be like, well, what are the other effects? We wanted to talk to you about a viz you built on the world's dependence on travel and tourism. So I'm trying to talk and share the screen at the same time. So what? Can you see your visualization?
Yes, I can.
Hey, I shared the right screen, almost like I know what I'm doing. So what we have here is, it is a visualization showing all the countries. Why don't you just quickly describe what's on the viz for us?
Yeah, so basically this data visualization takes data that is provided yearly by the World Travel and Tourism Council, and it breaks every single country into the percentage of their GDP that is based directly off of the travel and tourism industry. So if you think about like tourist activities, hotels, things that tourists typically book and do when they're in these other countries, it takes all of these countries and see what percentage of their GDP comes directly from the travel industry. So it's broken into 4 categories: percentage of GDP that's less than 2%, percentage of GDP that's between 2% and 5%. Then you have 5% and 7%, and then you have that greater than 7%, which are really those countries that are highly reliant on the tourism industry to kind of function as to have their economy function.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So the viz itself is almost not really the topic of conversation we're looking at here. It's what I'm interested in finding out is, why did you build this viz in the first place? What was the motivation?
Definitely. So I originally was scrolling on Twitter, as I do most nights as I'm winding down, and I came across an article that was written by Pew Research that looked at, in the United States, which of the states are going to be impacted the most by, the shutdown travel that we currently have. So that's the visualization that you see here. And then my mind sparked to my own personal thoughts, like, alrighty, typically when I'm a tourist, I do not travel inside of the United States. So yes, I've been to Nevada. Yes, I've been to Florida, which are the highlights on this particular map. But I wanted to get an understanding of the larger scale. What about the countries, that are outside of, the United States? And I wanted to see how those countries would be impacted, because typically those are the countries that I like to travel to. So I did a couple of research that night, and I found another visualization that looked at the percentage of GDP for each country, which was this visualization that you see here. And what hit here was that the size of the countries are based off of the dollar amount that's contributed from the travel industry. And then the color of the country is based off of kind of the same color that I displayed in my visualization: highly reliant, somewhat reliant, reliant, and then less reliant. But what I didn't see here were some of the countries that my actual family is from. So if you look on the left-hand side of the visualization, you see the United States, you see Mexico, you see Jamaica, and some of these larger countries. But from a personal standpoint, my family is from smaller islands that a lot of tourists go to, and I didn't see those on this visualization. So I didn't see St. Kitts, where my mother is from. I didn't see Trinidad, where my father is from. I didn't see Jamaica, where some of my friends are from. And that's what sparked my interest to now dive into the data behind the scenes and start to understand, personally, how some of my family members are being impacted by what's going on today.
And what was the thing you actually learned from this?
I learned that a lot of these smaller countries are highly reliant on tourism and travel. So I can just assume that a lot of these countries are being impacted, because not only do the dollars that, tourists spend in these countries, they're being, impacted, but also like employment. So I also looked at the employment for a lot of these smaller islands. I looked at St. Kitts in particular, where my mother is from, and saw that 11% of their GDP comes directly from the travel and tourism industry, and 23% of their employees are, they're employed because of the travel and tourism industries. And that's a huge percentage, for such a small island. So that was really something that stood out. And that was the case for a lot of the smaller islands. So I can just only imagine what, not only what the entire economy is going through right now, but what individuals are going through, and probably even some of my family members.
Yeah, I think that's what particularly stood out on this viz for me, is that, normally we look at the big numbers. Who are the top 5 economies in the world, right? And, it's not the small Pacific Islands or the smaller island nations, but as a proportion to the whole, it's absolutely devastating what is potentially happening to them throughout the rest of this year. So I really appreciate how you and Amanda, you've both talked about the, well, what about me aspect of data exploration. We know from many research studies and seeing what some of the successful visualizations online, that if you can find you in the data, then you engage with it a little bit more. And I think what I'm very impressed by what you've done, Chantilly, is say, well, I can't see me in this data, so I'm going to go and find the data myself. So you seem like, is it fair to call you a data explorer?
Yeah, I would definitely call myself a data explorer, consumer, visualizer, all of it.
Yeah. But so what is it that drives you and motivates you to, what do you need to be able to respond to a visualization and then think, I'm going to go and find more data, explore it and share it to make it more relevant to me? I mean, what is the secret sauce that makes it work for you?
I think what triggers it is curiosity. So you come across a visualization, and I look at a visualization. I typically don't take the visualization, for face value. I take it as face value, and then I try to dive into it a little bit more. So I ask more questions, and I will say some of those questions relate to me personally, or they relate to people that I know personally. And then from there, if I'm not able to find a visualization that can answer some of those questions, I typically go out and find the data that can help me answer those questions. So sometimes I'll spend days going through data sources and trying to validate data sources from some of these organizations. And once I have that data, then it's about, not only trying to present this data in a way that is meaningful for myself, but also consumers of it who typically want to ask those questions about themselves too. So maybe they have family that's in Italy and they kind of want to see, where they play out on this scale. So that's typically the process that I follow. It's like going down a rabbit hole. You start with a bunch of different questions, then you find the data, and then you create the visualization that kind of tells the story that you want.
I see Amanda smiling there, and I'm smiling too, because I think the three of us here are very familiar with that rabbit hole concept. I downloaded Apple have just shared a data set about searches on Apple Maps. And I'm like, I don't have time to explore this data today, but of course I spent 30 minutes exploring the data because that's what we do, right? I actually think what you just described there, Chantilly, is something about fundamentally about how people can learn these skills about data curiosity. And the phrase that resonates there is, it's data you are personally engaged in. And I don't know if this is something the two of you tell people that when you're teaching them about data visualization, but if you want to learn how to use a data analysis product, go and find data that's about you, because you have that motivation. Do you both resonate with that?
Yeah, I mean,
Amanda, go ahead.
I do, and I think Chantilly's story is great because it's about both the side of trying to find yourself in the data and trying to find data that you can find yourself in. I think we talk a lot about the value of understanding how data gets created, because understanding how data gets collected is really fundamental to understanding the nuances of what the stories might be in it, how we analyze it, what comparisons can you or can't you make. And I think we talk a lot about how you can create your own data sets about you, kind of like the quantified self, right? We see those kind of pieces on people understanding the data and the data about themselves and seeing themselves in the data. But it's also just as much about the context within which you live. I mean, Chantilly, you talked about it's where your mom and your dad are from. It's where your friends are from. So it's not just about us as individuals. It's about the world that we live in and kind of the space we occupy. So I think it's a great example of finding external data sources and being a great consumer of data, Chantilly. You talked just about that, like going and finding the data and understanding it. And I think we maybe too often are quick to go ahead and say, oh, this is a cool data set. Let's load it into this great tool that'll let me visualize it fast. Instead of taking a pause and saying, what bias might be in the data? What kind of comparisons should I or shouldn't I make? What other issues might be at play that may impact this? So your story about moving away from raw numbers of travel tourism dollar sizes and more share of economy, I think is really powerful.
Yeah, definitely. And to add to that, it's like on the visualization side of it, consuming a visualization, it's having that curiosity to continue to ask those questions. It was when I saw that infographic that had all of those countries, and I saw, okay, it's missing some countries that I'm most familiar with, and then having that curiosity to then go out and find a better data set that can help answer some of those smaller questions that you have, and maybe even somebody else, that's looking at this visualization might have, and trying to bring all of that together.
Amazing. Okay, so we're getting to coming up on time. So I wanted to just let you talk a little bit about the program you run, Millennials and Data, because this has been a really successful thing you've started with a really great mission. I just wanted to just give you a chance to tell us a little bit about what it's all about.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. So I run Millennials and Data. We're on our third cohort. We actually have our first virtual cohort that's running right now. So we didn't really have to change anything with the shutdown. But basically, I started this program as a way for millennials or students who are in school, maybe even high school, college students, to help them understand how they do not have to major in a technical field like engineering or data analytics in order to incorporate data into their respective majors. I think it's important that individuals understand how to consume these visualizations, especially the amount of visualizations and data that's being poured to us through the media today. I wanted to make sure that students and like in the very early stages of their career, they're able to understand that, and that it didn't take a pandemic to happen for them to start to really want to understand, the nuances of data. So that's why I started Millennials and Data, and the students are actively looking at visualizations, trying to interpret them, asking a lot of those questions that Amanda, you brought up earlier, like what's missing here? How can we make this better? And things like that.
Fantastic. And how can people find out more about that?
You can follow us on Twitter at Millennials Data. So that's 2 L's and 2 N's because most people spell millennials wrong. And then we also have a website, millennialsanddata.com. And we'll also be opening up applications for students and professionals to join the MAD 4 cohort that's going to launch in the fall.
Fantastic. I tend to type it into Google to search that kind of thing and let Google fix the spelling for me, because yeah, that's a tough one. Excellent. Well, look, that I think pretty much concludes our time. So Amanda, Chantilly, thank you so much for another great conversation. All the best with what you're doing with Millennials and Data and digging out some more fascinating data stories, Chantilly. To those of you watching, thank you again. Do get in touch with myself or Amanda or Tableau's Twitter accounts or social media accounts. Let us know what questions you'd like us to answer, or if you see any data stories you think we could be looking at. We also have the Tableau COVID-19 Data Hub. If you want to explore a clean data set of cases, then you can go and download that. We're also curating visualizations which we think are telling interesting stories and telling some customer stories about how they're finding success using data to make decisions in this difficult time. Also, if you want to take this time to learn Tableau and develop some new skills, then we are giving away free access to our e-learning resources. You can get 90 days of training for free. So again, go to the COVID-19 Hub for that. Otherwise, follow us on social media. Let us know in the comments what you think, what you'd like to see us cover in future episodes. And with that, that is it for today. I'd like to thank Chantilly and Amanda once again. Thank you for watching, and we will see you all next week. Take care.